The Royal Crest Resort stood as a symbol of opulence, towering against the skyline like a palace in the clouds. Its marble floors reflected the golden light of crystal chandeliers, while sprawling infinity pools glistened under the sun. Every detail of the resort screamed wealth and exclusivity, catering only to the world's elite. CEOs, celebrities, and dignitaries who lived lives most could only dream of. But behind the dazzling facade was a hidden world. A world of staff who worked tirelessly in the shadows, ensuring the luxury of others while quietly living their own modest lives. Among them was Sophie Wells, a 24-year-old housekeeper who had been part of the resort's invisible army for the past 3 years. Sophie was no stranger to hard work. She moved through the resort's lavish halls with quiet efficiency, her uniform crisp, her demeanor professional. But behind her calm exterior was a young woman brimming with untold stories and unfulfilled dreams. Sophie had always wanted to be a photographer. The way light danced across a landscape or emotions froze in a frame fascinated her. And she dreamed of one day capturing those moments with her own camera. But life had other plans. Sophie's family needed her, and dreams didn't pay the bills. So she buried her aspirations deep within her, channeling her energy into her work at the resort. Day after day, she cleaned suites that seemed more like mansions, navigating a world so vastly different from her own. The guests were always the same, distant, demanding, and unaware of the effort that went into their comfort. Sophie had learned to stay invisible, to be seen only when necessary. That was until the morning Ethan Hawke arrived. Ethan Hawke wasn't just any guest. His name alone carried weight, a billionaire tech CEO whose innovations had changed the world. Known for his sharp mind, commanding presence, and guarded personal life, Ethan rarely made public appearances, let alone stayed in places where anyone could glimpse behind the curtain of his carefully curated image. His arrival at the resort set off a ripple of whispers among the staff. Did you hear? Ethan Hawke booked the Ocean View suite. The CEO? He never stays anywhere like this. Imagine the tip he might leave. But for Sophie, it wasn't excitement she felt when Mrs. Charlotte Matthews, the no-nonsense head housekeeper, called her into the office. It was nerves. Sophie, Mrs. Matthews began, her tone serious. We've got a very important guest checking in today. Ethan Hawke. The Ethan Hawke. He'll be staying in the Ocean View suite, and I want you to handle it personally. Sophie's heart sank. She had heard of Ethan Hawke. Everyone had. He was the kind of man who moved in a world completely foreign to hers. Powerful, wealthy, and untouchable. She swallowed her nerves, nodding. Of course, Mrs. Matthews. I'll take care of it. Walking toward the exclusive suite, Sophie felt a strange mix of apprehension and determination. The Ocean View suite was a place she had only seen once before, a luxurious haven reserved for the ultra-wealthy. Located on the top floor, it offered sweeping views of the endless ocean, its every detail designed to exude sophistication. She paused at the door, taking a deep breath. The weight of her reality pressed on her shoulders. She was just a housekeeper, a small cog in the grand machine of luxury. What did it matter if her life and dreams seemed insignificant here? This was her job and she was good at it. Pushing the door open, Sophie stepped into the suite. The room was breathtaking, with floor-to-ceiling windows framing the azure ocean, sleek modern furniture that seemed untouched, and carefully curated artwork that belonged in a museum. Everything was pristine, radiating a kind of perfection Sophie had never experienced in her own life. She moved methodically, dusting, straightening, and ensuring every corner was spotless. But as she approached the bathroom, something stopped her. The faint sound of running water reached her ears. Her heart skipped a beat. Is someone in there? She thought, frozen in place. Before she could turn to leave, the bathroom door swung open. Standing in front of her was Ethan Hawke, his damp hair glistening in the sunlight that streamed through the window. He wore nothing but a white towel wrapped loosely around his waist, his presence both commanding and overwhelming. Sophie's eyes widened as she stammered, "I'm so sorry. I thought the suite was empty." Her cheeks flushed as red as the sunset, and she quickly turned to leave, but in her haste, she caught her foot on the edge of the carpet. Stumbling backward, she braced herself for impact, but it never came. Ethan moved swiftly, his strong hand catching her by the arm. His grip was steady, warm, and reassuring. "Careful," he said, his voice deep and calm, a faint hint of amusement in his tone. Sophie's heart raced as she straightened herself, pulling away quickly. I didn't mean to intrude," she whispered, unable to meet his piercing blue eyes. "I thought the room was empty." "It's fine," Ethan replied, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I should have locked the door." Mumbling an apology, Sophie hurried out of the suite, her mind reeling. As she walked back to the staff quarters, her thoughts were a whirlwind. The way his eyes had locked onto hers, the warmth of his touch. It was a moment she couldn't forget, no matter how hard she tried. She was just a housekeeper, a speck in the grand scheme of his world. What could someone like Ethan Hawke possibly see in her? And yet, a small part of her couldn't help but wonder if that brief encounter meant something more. Little did Sophie know, her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The plush carpeting muffled Sophie's hurried footsteps as she approached the door to the Ocean View suite. Balancing her cleaning supplies, she took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The suite was massive, far beyond anything she could ever imagine stepping into under normal circumstances, and housed one of the wealthiest men in the world, Ethan Hawke. Sophie carefully pushed the door open, the soft click echoing in the pristine silence. She peeked inside and saw nothing but the breathtaking view of the ocean through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The room appeared empty. Relieved, she stepped inside and began her work, moving methodically as she always did. The suite was a masterpiece of modern luxury. Sleek furniture, minimalist decor, and that endless view of the ocean. Sophie worked her way through the space, ensuring every corner gleamed. As she approached the bathroom, she heard the faint sound of running water. Her heart skipped a beat. "Is someone in there?" she thought, panic bubbling up inside her. But before she could react, the bathroom door swung open. Standing before her was Ethan Hawke, his damp hair glistening in the sunlight filtering through the window. A towel hung loosely around his waist, his broad shoulders and confident posture radiating the kind of effortless power that only someone like him could possess. Sophie froze, her eyes widening in shock as the reality of the situation hit her. I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I thought the room was empty." Ethan's piercing blue eyes met hers, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to still. He raised an eyebrow, his expression caught between amusement and curiosity. Before Sophie could turn to flee, her foot caught the edge of the plush carpet, and she stumbled backward. Time seemed to slow as she braced for the fall. But then his hand. In one swift motion, Ethan stepped forward and caught her by the arm, his grip steady and warm. "Careful," he said, his deep voice laced with calm reassurance. Sophie's heart raced as she steadied herself, pulling away quickly and avoiding his gaze. Her face flushed crimson as embarrassment washed over her. I didn't mean to intrude," she whispered, her words barely audible. Ethan's lips curled into a faint smile, one that Sophie couldn't decipher. "It's fine," he said simply, his tone easy yet commanding. "I should have locked the door." She nodded hastily, clutching her cleaning supplies like a lifeline. I'll just leave now." Without waiting for a response, Sophie turned and rushed out of the suite, her cheeks still burning. She barely registered the opulent decor as she made her way back to the staff hallway, her mind replaying the moment over and over. The way his eyes had lingered on hers, the warmth of his touch, it was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Sophie shook her head, trying to push the memory aside. "He's just a guest," she muttered to herself. "Nothing more." But for Ethan, it was far from nothing. As he stood in the suite, watching the door close behind her, he couldn't help but feel intrigued. Sophie's flustered honesty, her raw, unpolished demeanor. It was unlike anyone he had encountered in years. In his world, people were calculated, polished, and often manipulative. But Sophie, she was different, genuine, real. For the first time in a long time, Ethan Hawke found himself wondering about someone who wasn't a part of his carefully constructed world. Days passed, but the encounter between Sophie and Ethan lingered in both of their minds. Sophie tried to push the memory aside, convincing herself it was just an awkward moment, nothing more. But fate had other plans. Ethan Hawke extended his stay at the Royal Crest Resort, a rare decision for a man whose life was scheduled down to the minute. What surprised Sophie even more was the special request he made. Ethan wanted Sophie to handle his room service personally. Her heart raced when Mrs. Matthews delivered the news. "He specifically asked for you," the head housekeeper said, her tone curious but firm. Sophie nodded, masking her confusion. Why her? What could someone like him possibly want from a housekeeper? The first few deliveries were simple. Sophie brought meals or fresh towels, exchanged polite pleasantries, and left. But each time, Ethan made an effort to engage her in conversation. At first, she kept her responses short, unsure if she should let her guard down. One day, as she was setting down his breakfast tray, Ethan broke the silence. "You've been working here for a while, haven't you?" he asked, his tone casual but warm. "Yes," Sophie replied, keeping her focus on the task at hand. 3 years now. "And is this what you've always wanted to do?" he pressed, leaning back in his chair, his gaze steady. Sophie hesitated. No guest had ever asked her that before. After a moment, she sighed, her hands pausing mid-movement. "No, I've always wanted to be a photographer. But dreams don't pay the bills." Ethan's expression shifted, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. "Photography," he said thoughtfully. "What kind?" "Landscapes," Sophie said, her voice softening. "There's something about capturing the world as it is, untouched, raw. It makes me feel free." Ethan nodded, his gaze never leaving her. "Why don't you pursue it?" She gave a small, bittersweet smile. "Life doesn't always give you that kind of luxury." For the first time, Ethan felt a pang of something he couldn't quite place. Admiration mixed with guilt. Here was someone who had so little, yet spoke with such sincerity and passion. It was a stark contrast to the people in his life, who seemed to have everything yet cared about nothing. As the days went on, their conversations grew deeper. Sophie spoke of her family, her struggles to make ends meet, and the way her camera, an old, second-hand model, was her only escape from reality. Ethan, in turn, began to open up about his own life, something he rarely did. He spoke of the pressures of being a CEO, the loneliness of always being surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Sometimes, he admitted one evening, "It feels like everything I've built is hollow. Like none of it really matters." Sophie looked at him, surprised by his honesty. "How can you say that? You've accomplished so much." "Accomplishments aren't the same as fulfillment," Ethan said quietly, his gaze drifting to the window. It was in these small, stolen moments that their connection deepened. Ethan found himself drawn to Sophie's kindness, her authenticity, and the quiet strength she didn't even realize she had. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was simply herself, and that was more refreshing than anything he had experienced in years. Sophie, in turn, began to see a different side of Ethan. A man who wasn't defined by his wealth or power, but by his vulnerability and his search for meaning. One evening, as she finished setting up his dinner tray, Ethan glanced at the small sketchpad Sophie carried in her pocket. "What's that?" he asked, motioning to it. "Oh," Sophie said, pulling it out hesitantly. "Just some doodles. I like to sketch scenes I'd photograph if I could." Ethan flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing as he studied her work. "These are incredible," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. Sophie blushed, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her apron. "They're nothing special." "They are," Ethan insisted, his tone firm. "You have a gift, Sophie. Don't downplay it." For the first time, Sophie felt seen, not as a housekeeper, but as someone with dreams and talent. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt something real. A connection that wasn't tied to money, status, or appearances. Neither of them said it out loud, but they both knew. This was the beginning of something neither of them could have expected. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the Royal Crest Resort. Sophie stood on the balcony of Ethan's suite, carefully arranging a tray of tea and pastries. The air was thick with unspoken tension, not the uncomfortable kind, but the type that comes with change, with possibility. Ethan stepped out from the living room, his gaze immediately drawn to Sophie as she worked. For the past few days, he'd been observing her. Not just her diligence, but the quiet passion she carried. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite define, that set her apart from everyone else he'd ever known. "Sophie," Ethan said, breaking the silence. She turned to face him, startled. "Yes, Mr. Hawke?" "Call me Ethan," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He motioned toward the chairs on the balcony. "Join me for a moment." Sophie hesitated, glancing between the chair and the tray she had just set up. "I'm not sure if that's appropriate," she murmured. "It's just tea," Ethan said gently. "And I'd like to talk to you." Reluctantly, Sophie sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The view from the balcony was breathtaking, the ocean stretching endlessly into the horizon, its waves shimmering in the fading light. But Sophie couldn't enjoy it. Her nerves were on edge, unsure of what Ethan wanted to say. "You know," Ethan began, his tone thoughtful, "in my world, everyone's chasing something. Power, money, influence. But very few people actually know what they're passionate about." "You do?" Sophie blinked, caught off guard. "I don't know what you mean," she said softly. "Yes, you do," Ethan said, leaning forward slightly. "Photography. The way your eyes light up when you talk about it, the sketches you carry with you. It's clear that it's more than just a hobby. It's a part of who you are." Sophie looked away, her cheeks flushing. "Maybe it was once. But dreams don't pay the bills, Ethan. And someone like me, I don't belong in a world where things like that are possible." Ethan's brow furrowed, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "Who told you that?" he asked, his voice firm but kind. "No one had to tell me," Sophie replied, her voice tinged with sadness. "It's just how life is. People like me don't get to chase dreams. We survive." Ethan leaned back, his expression softening. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "You're so wrong. You have more potential than you realize, Sophie. The only thing holding you back is your belief that you don't deserve more." Sophie felt a lump rising in her throat. No one had ever spoken to her like this before, like she was more than just a housekeeper, more than just someone doing what she had to do to get by. "I don't know if I can," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What if I fail?" Ethan's gaze softened, his voice lowering. "Everyone fails, Sophie. But it's not about failure, it's about trying. You don't have to do it alone. I'll help you if you'll let me." Sophie looked at him, her heart pounding. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you deserve it," Ethan said simply. "And because I see something in you that you don't see in yourself. You're authentic, Sophie. You're real. And that's rare in a world like mine." The sincerity in his words made Sophie's chest tighten. A part of her wanted to believe him, to take the leap he was encouraging her to take. But the fear of the unknown loomed large, casting doubt over the fragile hope beginning to bloom inside her. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice shaky but resolute. Ethan smiled, leaning back in his chair. "That's all I ask." As Sophie returned to her duties later that evening, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Ethan's words echoed in her heart, stirring something she had buried long ago. A belief that maybe, just maybe, she was capable of more than she'd ever allowed herself to dream. And for the first time in years, she began to wonder if stepping into the unknown might be worth the risk. The golden rays of the sun painted the sky as Sophie Wells stood outside the modest campus of the city's art school. In her hands, she clutched an acceptance letter, a symbol of a new beginning. She had taken the leap, one that felt terrifying yet exhilarating. And it was all because of Ethan's unwavering belief in her. It hadn't been easy. Sophie had spent years telling herself that dreams were for people who could afford them, for those who weren't weighed down by responsibility. But Ethan's words had ignited a spark she couldn't extinguish. With his encouragement, she had enrolled in art school, finally daring to pursue her passion for photography. Her first day was a mix of excitement and nerves. The classrooms were filled with creative energy, the students buzzing with ideas. Sophie felt out of place at first, but as she picked up her camera, everything else faded away. For the first time in years, she felt alive. Meanwhile, Ethan was undergoing his own transformation. He had spent his life chasing success, building empires and amassing wealth. But the deeper his connection with Sophie grew, the more he realized how hollow his achievements felt without purpose. One crisp morning, Ethan made a decision that shocked the business world. He stepped down as CEO of his tech company. The headlines buzzed with speculation, but for Ethan, the choice was simple. He wanted a life filled with meaning, not just accomplishments. A life where he could focus on what truly mattered. Together, Ethan and Sophie began carving out a new path. They moved into a cozy apartment near the beach, a far cry from the grandeur of the Royal Crest Resort or Ethan's penthouse. The simplicity of their new life felt refreshing, like a breath of fresh air. Sophie spent her days immersed in her art, capturing the beauty of the world through her lens. Ethan, free from the demands of corporate life, supported her every step of the way, encouraging her to showcase her work at local galleries. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sophie and Ethan walked hand in hand along the shore. The waves lapped gently at their feet, and the salty breeze carried with it a sense of calm. Sophie glanced up at Ethan, her heart full. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly. "Miss what?" Ethan replied, his voice warm. "The power, the prestige." "All of it," Sophie said, motioning toward the distant lights of the city. Ethan smiled, squeezing her hand. "Not for a second," he said. "None of it mattered as much as this." Sophie's cheeks flushed as she leaned her head against his shoulder. "I wouldn't have done any of this without you," she admitted. Ethan stopped, turning to face her. "You would have, Sophie. You just needed someone to remind you of what you're capable of." She smiled, tears welling in her eyes. For so long, she had doubted herself, but with Ethan by her side, she had learned to believe in her own strength. As they continued their walk, their laughter and quiet conversation filled the space between the crashing waves. The simplicity of the moment was perfect, a reminder that love, trust, and courage could bridge even the widest divides. Their story wasn't about wealth or status. It was about two people who had found each other in the most unexpected way and changed each other's lives forever. Together, they had proven that sometimes the greatest riches in life are the ones that can't be bought. If you enjoyed this heartfelt story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more amazing tales. Your support keeps us going.